Thank you so very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you as we bring together Paris and Montreal and Toronto for this conversation, and to have the opportunity to speak with a colleague and really a master teacher and one of the great, I think, thinkers and writers of the Jewish world in our time. And so I wanted to start off with this question. The book is a short and full book, and it has 11 chapters, I think, each named after and telling the story of one or two people or beings, beginning with Azrael, the angel of death, going to Elsa Kayat, who you speak of as the Charlie Hebdo psychoanalyst, and goes from there to talk about anyone from a woman named Miriam, who's an Upper East Side New York woman who ends up attending her own funeral, to, of course, Moses from biblical times and how he confronts and encounters his own death. And one of the things that really resonated with me was how you spoke about the role of rabbi as being storyteller, that we have the privilege of accompanying people, helping them tell their stories, and sometimes sharing those stories after they've gone. And so I wonder how, from all your years in the rabbinate, how did you decide which stories you wanted to tell? And if there are any from the book that you would want to start us off by sharing with this audience.
Well, thank you so much for this invitation and this somehow bridge that connects tonight's France and Canada. It's very late here in Paris, so it seems like we are other moments in our day, but it's wonderful to connect. Indeed, I often explain that for me the work that is closest to my work as a rabbi is to be a storyteller. It's not easy to explain, especially I feel, for example, in France, in a very non-religious society where the culture of the majority is Catholicism, practicing Catholicism. People think that a rabbi is like a Jewish priest or have no really idea what our work is about. And I'm often explaining to people that I really truly believe, and I think it's a very old and ancient rabbinic belief, that stories can change the world, that in a way, with words and with stories, you can build as much as you can destroy, or you can rebuild something. Stories have that power, but I think it's particularly true around death, when you are invited to witness this moment of passage, when in our rabbinic work, we are invited to not only be witnesses, but very often to speak about someone's life and make sure that the way it's precious in Jewish tradition, make sure that even though the angel of death knocked on the door, we're going to make sure that we say L'chaim, that somehow life will prevail, and the last word will be given to living power and not to death. I believe that we have the power through words, through storytelling, to make sure this happens. And it's a huge blessing, actually, like a privilege to be able to tell those stories. So I had to choose, you're right, it was not an easy task. I had to choose 11 stories. I could have spoken about many other stories of people I was honored to accompany. I have no idea why actually I chose that story and not another one. You know, very often stories choose you and you don't choose stories. Authors often know that. Since the book was released, I told myself so often, I wish I could write that new story. You know, I keep accompanying people every week through death processes or mourning processes, going to funeral homes or mourning houses, cemeteries, and I'm witnessing so many amazing accounts of lives that I think so many of those stories deserve to be told. You know, maybe I can share with you a story that happened to me recently at cemetery, a story that is not in the book. And when it happened to me, when I heard that moment, when I experienced that moment at cemetery, I really told myself, I wish I had written about this in my book. I was privileged to accompany a very old woman, an old grandmother who died surrounded by her children and grandchildren. And that old Jewish woman was a very loving mother and grandmother. She loved to, to hug her family and to cook. And on the day of her funeral, at some point, I invited the family to say a word. And I saw her granddaughter stepped, in front of me, in front of the coffin. She took a paper and she started to read. She started to read what she had written for her grandmother, and it went like this: 4 eggs, 250 grams of sugar, 200 grams of butter. And, her eulogy was the most beautiful eulogy I ever heard in my life. This granddaughter was simply giving testimony to the chocolate cakes recipe that was her love legacy. And, it helped me think about what kind of recipe of life we can live in this world. So this is what I believe. Each story needs to be told to make sure that somehow life wins.
That's really beautiful. I sometimes will go home from a funeral, and I know that we're both not only rabbis, but mothers, and I'll say to my kids, listen, I know that when my time comes, you're not going to praise my cooking in the eulogies, right? We all have our things that we bring, but I also certainly find that I often go home with a sense of, oh, this is something about how I want to live differently. And it's striking, right? The things that are remembered about people, that somebody left really high tips wherever they went because they thought that that was important, or somebody else who managed to have each of their children feel like they were the favorite. There are all of these pieces of wisdom, of course, that we then carry with us and try and bring forward.
And sometimes those stories are totally unexpected. Like, things happen, people didn't mean to tell those stories, but it's as if they were visited by a kind of angel who tells them, open your mouth and say this story. Recently I was officiating at the funeral in Paris, in Père Lachaise, in a very famous cemetery here in Paris. And the son of the deceased, before the ceremony, he insisted that he didn't want to say anything. He said, I won't be able to share anything with people who are there. I don't know exactly what to say about my father, except the fact that he loved to tell Jewish jokes. He told Jewish jokes constantly, very often jokes that were not that funny. And so the day of the burial arrived, and during that ceremony, suddenly he came forth and he said, what, I'm going to say a word. It was not, he wasn't sure he would do that, but in the end he started to talk, and the thing that he did was pretty amazing. He started to tell jokes. You have to imagine the scene. We're in the midst of this Parisian cemetery, and this man starts to tell jokes that are more inappropriate one after the other, like sex jokes and really inappropriate stories. And the entire crowd there is laughing on the floor. And again, it's unexpected. But in a way, we never know not only how we're going to be remembered, but also how we're going to be honored. Sometimes we go to funeral and it seems that people talk about the deceased as if it was a kind of a saint, as if he was a kind of Superman who was absolutely perfect his entire life. We all attended those kind of funerals. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I always feel it's a mistake to speak about people this way, because actually none of us wants to be Superman. I think we want to be superhuman. I think we want to be told in what we did and what we failed to do, in how we were strong and how we missed the point, and how we were not, what we dreamt of being, how we missed the mark. And sometimes disappointed, but sometimes we're also up to the task. And I think this is what builds our humanity.
And what we did with what we were given, right? Because so few people anticipate the challenges, sometimes the tragedies that they'll encounter in life, and where our humanity comes forward is how we respond and what that next generation, if there is one, takes from it. And I was struck by many things, but one of them was when you write about how often children of Holocaust survivors, when the time comes for the eulogy, don't necessarily have those stories if their parents, if their grandparents kept them to themselves, and that there can be a real lack there, a real absence. So on the one hand, we want to have something to tell. We want to be able to pay tribute to a life. We don't want to pretend people are saints. We don't have saints in Judaism for good reason. But the stories that emerge when we do have those stories really are often magnificent and moving and very, very human, as you say.
Yeah. But you're right when you say that in many families, the transmissions, if we're lucky, went through words, but in many, many families, in many of our Jewish families, for sure, transmission very often was made through silence, not through words. In the story, I'm telling indeed about the story in the book. I'm telling about the story about a man who came to see me because he wanted me to stand by his side when he buried his mother, an Holocaust survivor. And immediately in the conversation, I recognized that silence. I think I recognized it because I am myself a granddaughter of Auschwitz survivors, and the same silence, heavy silence, is part of my story, and I could perceive and feel exactly what he was somehow unable to tell me with words. The fact that in their transmission something was ripped, something was, the image I often use is a translation of the Hebrew word generation. In prayers and liturgy, we constantly speak about generations. In Hebrew, it's a very famous word, dor, dor vador, dor dorim. This word dor in Hebrew means generation, but to understand its meaning in Hebrew, you need to go back to its etymology. And lador in Hebrew originally is what you do, and this is where I'm not sure I'm going to find the words in English. When you build a basket,
when you weave a basket.
Weave a basket, that's the word I was missing. The very act of weaving the string to build a basket is called in Hebrew ladur, dor. And I think it's a very powerful image. If you imagine weaving a basket, you know that a basket is solid only when a string is attached to the line below and to the line above. And the stability and the ability for the basket to stand depends on this intergenerational link. And we know, and sometimes we experience this in our own life, in our own families, that many of us do carry baskets of broken strings. Sometimes it's somehow woven backward or ripped, and you have no idea how to reconnect the pieces, the elements of this construction. In Jewish funeral, there is this super powerful moment when, at the end of the ceremony, sometimes it's at the beginning, it depends on minhagim, on customs, you do what we call kriya, you cut a fabric, you cut open the fabric. This is the absolute sign of the mourner. The mourner have to wear on himself or on herself, or to acknowledge that something is ripped. And even if you try to sew it, it's never going to be back whole again, because something is forever incomplete in your life. And it's particularly strong in families where intergenerational trauma and intergenerational silence is at play.
So there's so much to talk about here, right? And one of the things that's striking to me, though I hadn't thought of it until now from reading the book, is that on the one hand, there's this disruption of connection that happens when someone dies, and we feel that when the fabric is torn. And And here I'll add, I don't know the custom in France, but when I first came to Montreal as a rabbi, having grown up in Toronto, I was struck by the fact that in the funeral homes in Toronto and in New York, where I was a rabbi and you were for many years as well, you get a black ribbon for the mourner, and that gets torn. Whereas in Montreal, it's a tie, it's a scarf, it's an actual item of clothing. It's much more powerful. I expect it's the same in France. Um,
Yeah.
and so we have that tear, but we also have this insistence on connection, right? That notion of dor, of generations, as you're saying. I actually love all of the etymology you bring into the book. And one that was new to me actually was when you talk about the stone that's placed
Mhm.
on the gravestone, the stones that show we visited, that's an even in Hebrew, and that connection you made of even as of and ben as parent and child, right? So that's this other insistence on continuity in the face of
Yeah.
disruption. And yet you notice this too, right? There are times when we as rabbis, maybe we're talking to the family, but that wasn't actually the person's community, right?
Mhm.
And so the family might not always know who or what was most important to that person in their
Mhm.
lives, and their continuity, their connection, their community comes in a different place, right? That happened much more, say, a generation ago with people who were gay and closeted. But we encounter that as well.
Absolutely. It happens sometimes. Fortunately, it doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. It happened to me a few times that I noticed while preparing a ceremony that the people who turned to me, who supposedly were the closest people to the person we accompany, were apparently not the closest one to in his life. You know, you feel suddenly that the people who turned to you didn't really know the person, or something remained secret or unrevealed in his or her legacy. Well, I remember a story, I think I tell that story in the book, of the brothers and sisters who came and told me about the person we accompany. And it was quite obvious fast in our conversation. Each time I was asking a question, they didn't really know the answer. I said, what was his passion? They told me, we don't exactly know. What were his dreams? I'm not sure. But, you know, there was like as if the puzzle missed important pieces, you know. And I arrived to the funeral, and suddenly it was obvious that the people who surrounded, you know, the body and the casket were the closest one, but not the ones I met. And they suddenly were able to describe me and to describe for us another man. You know, it brings us back to another very beautiful Hebrew etymology, the fact, or I should say Hebrew grammar, the fact that the word chaim in Hebrew doesn't exist in the singular form. You know, chaim is always a plural. None of us can have one life. You cannot conjugate life in the singular form. We always have to manage elements of our existence, of our lives within together. And I think it's so true for each of us. And we know it pretty well, you know, that we connect constantly elements of ourselves, elements of our lives. We know also that we have always those different voices in our head that are engaged in a dialogue. There's no such thing as a monologue, as one way to tell yourself. So it's important to listen to all those voices, even if sometimes they're a bit broken. You spoke just before about the fact that, you know, ripping a fabric or the ribbon is a powerful symbol. I think that more generally speaking, it's important to notice how much breaking, the act of breaking, is so central in Jewish tradition. I mean, think about everything we do. You know, our sacred stories, like Moses comes down from Mount Sinai and he breaks the tablet. We tell about the temple, the first and the second, and the fact that they were broken and destroyed. We start the Pesach, Passover, the story of the Exodus, by breaking a matzah. When people get married, we break a glass. When a boy is born, we cut something. Something about uncompletedness that keeps repeating itself in the narratives, the sacred stories, or the Jewish rites. And I think it tells us something super powerful about the way life and death, old ends in our life. We tend to think, and I think it's a huge mistake, that there is on one side life and completedness, and on the other side, death and losing and incomplete states of mourning. But I think that as we go through life, we need to acknowledge that an element of the living is that we constantly have to deal with what is broken, with what is not complete. Life depends on the fact that whether we like it or not, it's not going to remain complete. There is always a recognition of mourning processes we have to go through so that we keep on living, And I think it might sound as a counterintuitive philosophy, but I think it's a very profound one. In my past life, before I became a rabbi, I studied medicine in Jerusalem, and I remember studying in biology classes there a biological phenomenon that people know today, the fact that constantly in our body, if we're healthy, so death processes are going on. Our cells have to be destroyed or so that we remain healthy, because there is a renewal of our cells constantly. I mean, from the moment we started to talk now, I don't know, 20 minutes ago, if everything is okay, I think in our body, in our biological life, death processes have been engaged in a way, because life relies upon or depends upon a certain acknowledgement or process of dying. And I think in a very interesting way, Jewish philosophy and Jewish thought plays it all the time, because we know we will mourn people we love, we will mourn sometimes ideas, ideologies, dreams, love, will be alive.
There's actually a beautiful observation you make when you talk about your experience as a medical student dissecting a body, right? And you write about how the biology taught how much death is part of our lives, whereas what we do as rabbis teaches how we can make room in death for life. And so you write about that, those connections, and in a way that permeability. And I actually want to take that to go to questions around brokenness and around trauma, right? You wrote this book during the height of COVID. And when one of the things that you write early on in the book, and I think all of us obviously were impacted in different ways, certainly doctors, certainly public servants, frontline workers, and also clergy, right? In our own way, in terms of whether it was how many funerals we officiated or all of the restrictions we had that kept us from being with people in the ways that we were used to being able to do. And you write, in 2020, across the world, the angel of death decided to visit almost everywhere, knocking on doors at each continent. And you go on to say the pandemic is a reminder that death has the power to meddle in all of our lives, and that the old separation between life and death was now gone.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you to reflect on that, because one of the things I think is, when we were in the midst of the pandemic, we said, oh, when this is finally over, this is going to change, or that's going to change, or we'll be more grateful for this, or we'll change how we do that. And I think it's a really open question, right? Whether those changes have held. We'll talk, I think we need to talk about October 7th in a moment, but before that,
yeah, it's funny because
about what's changed, right? From what you wrote that book until now, do you think how we experience death and how we talk about death has changed because of the pandemic?
Yeah. Well, listening to you, I was remembering, so many times during the COVID, we said, once it's over, my life is going to be different. Nothing is going to be the same. And I remember joking about it with my friends in Paris. You'll probably understand exactly what I mean. I remember that I was talking to friends. They were telling me, the minute it's over, everything's going to be different. I'm going to change my life. And then I was asking them, what are you going to do the first morning you can go out of your house? And people were, most of the time, were telling me, I'm going to go to my old Parisian coffee shop that I love, and I'm going to order, just like every other morning, my cappuccino with the, and I thought it was quite fascinating that somehow we wish and we pray and we promise change will come, but at the same time, nostalgia is so strong in our life that we promise it will never be the same, but we dream always, may it be the same in a way. You know what I mean? There's something paradoxical in this human nature. So indeed, you're right. I wrote this book during the crisis of COVID, when the angel of death visited us in a collective way we never expected. I tell in the book that until the COVID, I had a personal rabbinic tradition. Each time I was leading a ceremony, a funeral, and I was leaving cemetery, I had installed a tradition for myself that I would never go back home straight. I would always stop in a coffee shop or in a shop or in a museum, doesn't matter where, just to create a kind of sas, we say in French, like a separation, you know, before I would go back to my house and to my children. And during COVID, very fast, it became impossible because, probably just like you, I was asked suddenly to accompany people through the phone from my house instead of visiting them or going with them to the cemetery for a ceremony or whatever. I would lead ceremonies from my bedroom, from my apartment. And suddenly there was an absolute blurring of frontier. Everything was porous. And my place of living, suddenly it's as if, you know, the angel of death was also stepping on my territory of life, and everything became blurred. And this is when I decided I had to write the book. It was time for me to try to reflect upon some of the things I have learned through this accompaniment of death and mourning processes. And it brings me to, indeed, what you said. I wrote this book in 2020, 2021, at the peak of the COVID crisis. And here we are with other angels of death visiting us today. And it would be really weird not to acknowledge their presence. They're surrounding us everywhere. And the book is now released in America and in Canada. And it was released a few months ago in Israel, before October 7th. And I never imagined in my worst nightmare that the book Living with Our Dead would be released in Israel just a few weeks before an entire country is trying to live with death in a way that no one expected, an entire region that will have for many, many years to live with ghosts, with mourning, with the death that escapes any language, you know. Maybe I should have started with this, you know, a conversation. There is one thing I learned from my work as a rabbi, is that there is no way we can talk about death. When death is around, we can try to talk about life. We can try to make sure that we talk about the living processes and the power of life. But there is no way we can rightly talk about death, because I think it's almost the definition of death. Death escapes language. And we all probably experienced it or lived it by ourselves when we mourned or when we visited mourners' houses. You know, when you step into the mourners' houses, I'm sure you experienced it 1,000 times, people start to say stupid things. You know, when very often people tell to the mourners, like, sentences that are supposed to make him feel good or better or to comfort him. But most of the time, it's really, what we call in Hebrew shtuyot. It's nonsense. Like, it's like those sentences of the ways of God are mysterious, and the best ones live first, and it's probably better this way. I don't know, maybe in Canada you have other sentences, but it always seems to me that I wonder if there's someone in the history of humanity that felt comforted by those sentences. Probably not, but it simply tells us how much when people try to talk about death, they're always missing the mark.
Well,
So, yeah,
it feels like one of the wisest pieces of Jewish teaching around death and mourning is that you let the mourner start the conversation. And
absolutely.
yet it is almost impossible, I think, for us as human beings to do, because we want to find the words, we want to offer comfort.
Yeah.
And sometimes that effort is worse than the silence. Yeah.
You're right. And another phenomenon that very often takes place, and I'm sure people who listen to us now experienced it at least once in their life. When you go to a mourner's house, very often you witness that the visitors start to cry and the mourner becomes the comforter. Like, people start to cry, even though they're not the ones who lost a beloved ones. But the presence of death creates for each and every one of us a mirror effect. And suddenly, instead of comforting, you're comforted. Yeah, I don't know if it's proper English, by the people you're visiting. And it's very problematic. Because actually it testifies of your own discomfort. And so again, I think you're right. The Jewish tradition is very powerful on that matter when it says, when you step into a mourner's house, don't talk until the person talks to you, and make sure you're bringing him or her what he or she needs. It might be food, it might be silence, it might be physical presence, it might be religious, thoughts, but it might be anti-religious thoughts. Sometimes people want to hear about God in those moments, and other people really don't want to hear about God. And you'd better not even pronounce the word. And
we can
it's up
never
to you.
assume.
Yeah, you can never assume. And this is where each one of us needs to develop kind of antennas, you say in English, like
Antennae.
yeah, to feel, try to perceive what you're expected to do, to say.
It's not an accident, I think, that you bring that up in a really poignant chapter about a family where a child has died, and the child's brother is asking questions. And I think it's often in those most tragic situations that people are most desperate to come up with something to say, sometimes to distance themselves, sometimes to express their own grief, right? There is something human in it, but it doesn't always help, even when it's meant to help. Let me ask a very different question. There's so much for us to talk about, and I hope that, and I imagine that coming out of this conversation, that people will be inspired and encouraged to read this book and maybe also contemplate some of their own stories to tell. But you spoke earlier on about how there are many kinds of loss, right? That there can be the death of a person, there can be the death of a love, there can be the death of an idea. And one of the most thoughtful and challenging chapters, I thought, was near the end, where you write about Israel. You write about being in Israel for the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, alav shalom, of blessed memory, and how with him a lot of the peace process died. And that's the chapter where you talk about the hope for resurrection, where you say, I hope this vision of Zionism that I have can come back and not be, defeated by other visions, by other understandings. And it seemed to me it was a very courageous and challenging thing to speak about that kind of loss, that kind of confrontation, right? For a place that for you, for me, for many of us is very close to our hearts. And I just wonder if that's a chapter you've gone back to and how you're thinking about it these days.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity indeed to talk about it. When I wrote the book, it was really not obvious I would talk about Zionism and Israel, because I was talking mainly about people I accompanied. But suddenly it became obvious in the writing that because I was actually offering so much of my own mourning processes, and you know it as a rabbi, I think what enables us to stand by people's side in those terrible moments of brokenness is not our completedness, but our own brokenness. Like we can stand by people's side because somehow their mourning processes will be in echo with our losses. And at some point, I felt in the writing of the book that I had to talk about this huge mourning process for me, this huge breaking point in my life. Like a moment where something broke in my personal history, together with a kind of feeling of brokenness in a collective moment of loss. It was November 1995, the night I stood on this kikar, which was not called at the time Rabin, but there was this peace meeting. We were in the heart of Oslo process. I was at the time living in Israel, and we were on this this place to listen to Yitzhak Rabin on the evening he was assassinated. And I felt, and I still feel today, almost 30 years later, that something inside me broke forever. In my relationship with Israel, I mean, I still define myself as a Zionist, and I see that night, the fact that the rabbin's how to say assassin, like the killer, the guy who killed the fact that he also defined himself as a Zionist forced me to question how might it be possible that I'm using the same word, talking about words, to define my commitment to the state of Israel, the same word as he uses to take a weapon in his hand in the name of his Zionism. And this question remains for me a very open one, like a painful questioning. What I developed in the book, and of course it was written years before what we experience today, is a questioning around the notion of ownership, which is a very central notion in the Bible, in Jewish tradition. I'm convinced, and that's my reading of the text and of our Jewish tradition, that Jewish thought warns us strongly against a sense of ownership. You know, there's even in Hebrew the word to own is Baal. Baal means to own something, you're Baal. And in the Bible, it's also the name of an idolatry. We are told not to worship Baal. It's the same word, but it suggests that there is a threat always in our life when we are convinced that we are settled so much that we own something. It can be land, or it can be ideology, or it can be ideas. When you become owners, absolute owners of something you don't question anymore, you're never anymore in a kind of vulnerable relationship with what you own, then according to the Bible, you're in danger. Because we are supposed to be, and it's repeated again and again and again in the Bible, we are supposed to be in a state of mind of gerut, which is the opposite of being a Baal. Like, you're not supposed to be an owner, but you're always supposed to perceive yourself as a kind of stranger, even in the country that you own, even in the country where you have all legitimacy to be settled and to find security and to have sovereignty. Actually, and maybe it's a paradox, but the legitimacy of your sovereignty relies upon your acknowledgement of a certain form of strangeness to your own settlement that you don't absolutely own. And if I may say it this way, this is the definition of my Zionism. And I'm aware that it's absolutely not the definition of many other Zionists, but still we call ourselves with the same word. And I think it's a big challenge for all of us today. You know, it's a big challenge for Jewish thought, for Jewish identity. But, you know, let's go even further. I think it's a big challenge for the world today. I think each and every one of us, not just Jews, not just Zionists, but in this time that we all experience around the world, in Canada, in America, in France, everywhere, of identity obsession, that people are obsessed with their identity, with their group of affiliation, with something like certainties about who they are and what they own. I think there is a certain powerful philosophy of Gerut, let's call it this way, of like acknowledging kind of strangeness, you know, we don't own certainties, or something in us needs to remain in this, you know, acknowledgement of identity vulnerability that might save us, you know. So this is why actually, yeah, I go back often to this chapter. To tell you the truth, I now published a new book in France that is a new bestseller now in France about October 7th. And actually, I feel that this new book is like a development upon this chapter of Living with Our Dead. It's just like the, you know, the continuation of this reflection in a seismic time where many of us feel that somehow we lost a ground wherever we stand.